and honor the ancestors and all relations who walked this land long before we gathered here today. So the Coast Salish people have lived on these lands for over 4,000 years. And the Burnaby campus at SFU resides on the territories of 4 nations. So the Squamish Nation extends to the west and to the south. The Musqueam Nation extends to the south and the west. The Quequitlem Nation extends to the east, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nation extends to the north and the east. I wanted to share with you a poem by a local poet, Jennifer Lahandrell, about connection to land. My Indian land. A part of me was born behind the falling wooden walls. A part of me will die in the grass. I know I was there, in that photograph, somewhere. My heart begs my body to sleep on the side of that hill, anywhere in that grass, even for a night. It is so small, but it will always be mine, will always be Mission's, and I will always be on my way. So as we move forward today, I encourage us to be mindful of where we are, our connection to land, and the people who have and will reside on these lands in the future, and to do our work in a good way. Thank you.
And I now invite Diane Desjardins. Thank you, Sharon. I have the pleasure today of introducing our guest, Iris van der Tuin. She's an associate professor and program director of liberal arts and sciences at Utrecht University, the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. And she's also the director of the School of Liberal Arts. And I've drawn from the institutional website, her webpage, to provide you with a very brief summary of some of her activities, her scholarly work. And I invite you to consult that website to have a fuller account of the activities that are provided there. So trained as a feminist epistemologist and working as an interdisciplinarian, she is specialized in gender studies and new materialisms, especially pertaining to the humanities scholarship that traverses the 2 cultures. She co-authored with Rick Dolphijn New Materialism, Interviews and Cartographies, and that part of those readings are readings that students enrolled in the directed readings course have done in preparation for today's talk. And then also the seminar participants have read an article that Dr. van der Tuin wrote with Evelyn Geertz, and it's entitled The Feminist Futures of Reading Diffractively, How Barad's Methodology Replaces Conflict-Based Readings of Beauvoir and Irigaray. Professor van der Tuin wrote also Generational Feminism, New Materialism, Introduction to a Generative Approach, and edited Nature for Macmillan Interdisciplinary Handbooks Gender. And she currently chairs Cost Action, New Materialism, Networking European Scholarship, How Matter Comes to Matter. And it's a network that produces a number of really interesting reports that several of us have begun reading with great interest as well. Professor van der Tuin works in the H2020 project, Ethics of Coding, a report on the algorithmic condition. And she is founding editor with Rosie Braidotti of the book series New Materialisms and associate editor-in-chief of Macmillan Interdisciplinary Handbook Gender. And I won't go any further into the long list of publications, but I did notice on the website that for 2017 alone, she has over 25 presentations and publications listed on her page. This gives us all an idea. It's something we all have to do, right? But it gives us all an idea of how prolific she is as a scholar. And she also teaches courses in interdisciplinary studies, philosophy of science and humanities, and feminist theory and methodology. And I tried to read a course description in Dutch online, hoping that my limited competence in German might help me do a bit of language crossing to to understand it, and I didn't get very far with that, I'm afraid. So anyhow, we're very honored to have Professor Van den Tuin here as our speaker, and I would ask you to join me in welcoming her as a guest.
Thank you so much. This was such a lovely introduction. And a little bit terrifying. What did I do last year? I don't, well. Can everybody hear me also in the back? Yeah, it's all working? Perfect. So before I start, I want to thank, of course, everybody that has made my contribution to this seminar possible, especially Natalie. It has been a great time already here in Vancouver, and I'm happy to have many more conversations and discussions with you. Thank you all for coming. I'm very excited, most excited about the second part of this session, in which students are going to ask me questions. I can't wait. I'm like, skip the talk, let's go to the questions. But anyway, so my talk will focus on the nexus of philosophy of science, cultural theory, and cultural inquiry, so the practice of let's call it broadly, cultural studies. Because these are my three areas of specialization. And I will not necessarily talk about something in the world out there, but I will be actually trying to measure how our current algorithmic condition impacts our scholarly subjectivity, how we find ourselves in such a condition, how we are critiquing it, but always already being creative with it as well, responding to it, trying to be responsible with it, etc. And this discussion, I guess, uncovers what I see as new materialism's main contribution to scholarship today. I mean, I'm not in education, so I cannot speak from that field, although I have a great passion for education and I love talking about it. But I think that the whole idea of measurement as the co-constitution of meaning and matter is the most important contribution that new materialism tries to make. And of course, I am doing the measuring in a philosophical realm, which is already a strange thought because philosophers never think about their work as such. And most of you will measure in, let's say, education. So I hope we can learn a lot from each other, and I'm looking forward to the rest of this afternoon. So I have prepared two things. First, a sort of formal talk in which I will lay out the parameters of the work that I'm doing right now, and why I work on archive, for example. And then I have three examples that I will guide you through, and we can, go back to these examples later on, because I'm doing research on three female philosophers at the moment, and the research I'm doing on them, let's say, or with them. They're forms of measurement. So I would like to show you what I'm trying to do. So first, the more formal part of this talk, which is more like an introduction. So we live in an age of electronic reason and computational media. Our condition is algorithmic. How do we do our work as scholars in such an age and under such media-saturated conditions? What I'm suggesting here is that the age of electronic reason, the ubiquity of computational media, and our condition as algorithmic are not only valid objects of study for humanists, digital humanists, and post-humanists today. As scholars, we are also and always already affected by these so-called objects. We live and work with or within them, a situation that has methodological implications. In my work, I'm trying to make these entanglements into the focal point of my research, which is to say that the research is not supposed to reflect on or distance itself from media, but I'm seeking to co-respond with them, as this co-respondence is also and always already happening. There is a fundamental duration or a non-linear temporality to today's research practice, which is unavoidably our own onto-epistemology, but also shared with others. Both co-respondents and the durational are, however, not to say that difference has finally been exchanged for differing. After all, algorithms predict and shape the present and the future based upon past data. I want to say, though, that our computers execute in unforeseen ways, to quote Wendy Tuin. The future opens to the unexpected. Because of this, any programmed vision will always be inadequate, will always give way to another future, Wendy Tuin says. And this is her book on this topic. She argues that alongside the algorithmic effect of difference with a capital D, new media's modes of repetition and transmission open up gaps for a future beyond predictions based on the past, end of quote. So what are the methodological implications of all this for the work contemporary human scientists do? My research concerns primarily feminist and new materialist genealogies. And there are at least two ways of dealing with genealogies, and I've written quite a bit about this. Classification on the one hand, and cartography on the other. What are the mechanisms through which cartographies occur diffractively, as feminist and new materialist cartographers become sensitized to both the temporality of theory, so the virtual past and its actualizations, and subjectivity, the new materialist placing of the scholarly subject? She is never fully fixed and therefore not in full control. The classificatory approach to knowledge production and epistemology employs spatially linear arrangements of knowledge and theories pertaining to that knowledge based upon a process of sequential negation. Classifications are built upon the dialectical assumptions that knowledge production and epistemology relate hierarchically, and that both knowledge and knowledge theory develop progressively. Even though these very basic assumptions have since the 1970s been proven wrong or at least complicated by critical epistemologists, these disprovals have not prevented feminists and other critical scholars from using the classificatory approach at the margins of academia. In contrast, the cartographical approach provides horizontal mappings of research, or at least it tries to do that. And in these mappings, knowledge production, knowledge theory, and epistemology are no longer strictly distinguished from one another, and additionally, they become multiplicitous. So cartographies are situated in the sense of Donna Haraway, and as theoretically based and politically informed readings of the present, which is Rosie Braidotti's formula for what a cartography is. And she says, a cartographic approach fulfills the function of providing both exegetical tools and creative theoretical alternatives. Cartographies require accounting for one's location in terms of both space, geopolitical or ecological dimension, and time, historical and genealogical dimension, and provide alternative figurations or schemes of representation for these locations in terms of power as restrictive, potestas, but also as empowering or affirmative, potentia. The cartographical approach is one of the most important critical and creative responses, I would say, to the neoliberal corporatization of academia. Additionally, this approach finds itself caught up in its own acceleration, as the embodied and embedded cartographer must immediately deal not only with embodied and embedded images of knowing, but also with embrained and cultured and encoded images, not only with embodied and embedded cognition, but also with enacted, effective, and extended cognition, etc. In an attempt to acknowledge such complex and dynamic politics of location, I have in my recent research begun to theorize how cartographies occur both suddenly and seldom by way of post-human interpellation. Accelerated embodiment and embeddedness can be said to act at the core of feminist, anti-racist, and queer identity politics in three fundamental ways. One, by operating on the interwoven levels of differences between, differences among, and differences within groups of people. Secondly, by demonstrating how critique has run out of steam. And thirdly, by reaching out to Haraway's call for a sustaining of the possibility of webs of connections called solidarity in politics and shared conversations in epistemology. So echoing Braidotti, Haraway's plea in Situated Knowledges for a doctrine and practice of objectivity that privileges contestation, deconstruction, passionate construction, webbed connections, and hope for transformation of systems of knowledge and ways of seeing, acknowledges and embraces multiple webs. Firstly, webs that have the property of being systematic, even of being centrally structured global systems, Haraway says, with deep filaments and tenacious tendrils into time, space, and consciousness, which are the dimensions of world history. Second, webs of connections, the answer of which to world historical oppression is not anything goes. And thirdly, finally, the webs of differential positioning about which critical and creative scholars are insatiably curious. So this analysis of global systems that are on the one hand historically determined and frequently centrally structured, and the critical goal of webs of connections and creative curiosity about differential positioning on the other, boils down, I would say, to a certain practice of cartography. Systemic webs, however, among other classifications, unsuccessfully try to apprehend and represent technobodies and their knowledge production. Differential ethico-onto-epistemological positionings are constantly being formed by those bodies from within both confining and potentially liberating webs. And this process is one that occurs both consciously and unconsciously, and nowadays we would even say non-consciously. And I wrote about this in a publication that was in Parallax, in which I said, diffraction is always already at work when one reads, writes, and converses in a scholarly manner and otherwise, which challenges the boundaries of a humanist interpretation of hailing. Subjectivity, as it comes into being with or within diffraction, follows from what the philosopher Henri Bergson has called a disturbance of my whole consciousness like a stone which falls into the water of a pond. This is really my favorite metaphor. This stone generates a sudden interference pattern on the pond's surface, but the stone only apparently sets the still water into motion, which suggests that human consciousness must also be ever in motion. After all, affected by a name dropping, I am interrupted in a researcher instrument researched past, present, future entanglement. So both the workings of accelerated academia and this double face of situated map-making uncannily correspond. That is, they correspond as well as emerge with the affordances of Web 3.0, the internet of algorithmic media, automated document generation, and data subjectivity, with which I started my presentation. And in my current research project, I'm interested in the confining and the potentially liberating, the conscious, unconscious, and non-conscious implications of this web. I'm interested in both difference, capital D, and in differing, and I call it a project of speculative epistemology. And in this talk, I will try to talk at least about its parameters, durational, lively, but also about some methodological examples. So the Cameroon-born and South Africa-based theorist Achille Mbembe writes in his groundbreaking book, The Critique of Black Reason, that the world in the 21st century, as seen critically from the black experience, is in need of the making possible of the emergence, relatively lucidly, of the new demands of a possible universalism. Both the capacity to formulate such demands, which is an issue of epistemology and methodology, and the objective of a universalist horizon itself, which would be politics and ethics, are not without schisms or without friction or without historical and contemporary fiction. European schools of thought, enabled by and enabling violent practices of in and exclusion, have intruded the black experiences past and present, individually, structurally, and symbolically so, in both Africa and in the African diaspora alike, Europe and North America inclusive, of course. Reverberations of colonial and Orientalist intrusions are ongoing and will have had foreseeable and unforeseeable effects in the future. European philosophies, situatedly desired and situatedly despised on more than one continent only, are both totalizing. They are a European reductionism, to use the term by Aimé Césaire, and they are internally fractured along intersectional lines, the important foundation being a dialectic around issues of community. And this is what Mbembe writes. And I've been really inspired by his writing in the last year or so. So he says, the call to race, or the invocation of race, notably on the part of the oppressed, is the emblem of an essentially obscure, shadowy and paradoxical desire, the desire for community. Such a desire is obscure, shadowy and paradoxical because it is doubly inhabited by melancholia and mourning, and by nostalgia for an archaic that, which is always doomed to disappear. The desire is at once worry and anxiety, linked to the possibility of extinction, and a project. Moreover, it is the language of bemoaning and of a mourning that rebels in its own name. So community seems to always have been a lure for both oppressor and oppressed. And we, I don't know what that could entail, we still yearn for a horizon on its register. So Mbembe's work is so important for me because I think it is a renewed form of a standpoint epistemology that complexifies feminist epistemologist Sandra Harding's theory of strong objectivity. So instead of reaching beyond the Hegelian standpoint to a postmodern epistemology, so instead of exchanging the desire for gendered, racialized, or sexualized community for a theory of difference as diversity, Mbembe reaches into psychoanalysis as to understand the paradoxical communal dynamics of subject formation and ethical citizenship. And I must exert myself to try to understand this paradoxicality, running the risk of European reductionism and of what feminist and anti-racist anthropologist Gloria Wekker calls, for the Dutch, a white innocence. Alongside such a striving for complication and worldliness on my part, as both a scholar and a person, Mbembe's work on genealogy through and beyond European philosophical schools is all the more important for a project on feminist and new materialist epistemology, as I try to observe, make observable, and visualize, to measure, to contemplate and theorize sets of references and quotations that are generative and radically open. The project is to refrain from continuing the Eurocentric habit of closing down one's speculations by reverse projection of European reductionism on politics of citation, while at the same time doing justice to both histories and ongoing practices of scholarly European reductionism in intersectional keys. So I constantly try to work on two registers. Leveling up standpoint theory implies working through community as recognizably dialectical and beyond a diversity thinking of adjectification. Mbembe at once affirms the Hegelian dialectics, just like the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir did for upper and middle class white women exclusively in The Second Sex, and he searches for a new horizon beyond totalization and without individualism. Working through a Hegelian dialectics of community on the one hand, and on the other working beyond the individualist horizon of diversity thinking, implies the necessity of both holding on to the ideal of community and of qualitatively shifting its foundational dialectics. For one thing, individualism, the common denominator of assuming one, man, as well as of endless adjectification, must be avoided at all costs. Not only does individualism come dangerously close to advanced capitalist and neoliberal normalizations, but also does it impossibilize communal dynamic. For the carefully calibrated apparatus, we must read the epilogue of Critique of Black Reason and turn to Mbembe's more recent monograph, Politique de l'inimitié. Where is it? Yes. The epilogue suggests convincingly that the preferred apparatus implies a practice of unkinning. Unkinning can be best explained with reference to the Bergsonian pair of virtual and actual as opposed to possible and real. The main problem with community in most existing global, national and local circumstances, and these circumstances are entangled as well as they are more than human, is a discursive logic according to which we live and work as per an approach that would aim first to enclose, to stay within the enclosure of what we call our own kin. Such a logic realizes, in the sense of it effectuates, the very possibility of difference as negation, so difference with a capital D. In Mbembe's words, in such conditions we create borders, build walls and fences, divide, classify and make hierarchies. We try to exclude from humanity itself those who have been degraded, those whom we look down on, or whom do not look like us, those with whom we imagine never being able to get along, end of quote. Here we see the Foucauldian power-knowledge structures of how intersectional analytic categories, such as race, are intimately bound up with lived experience as well as with knowledge production, and how daily life is in turn intimately bound up with academic study. How then to shift this European reductionism, as it has been internalized within circumstances across the globe, across multiple scales, and across racial divides. Mbembe suggests starting not from the possibility of realizing what we think we know, but rather from a virtual space. And this space is the space that Barad, for example, in her most recent work, calls quantum field theory. So we have to start from a virtual space in which a durational apparatus actualizes different differences, of which also surprising interference patterns, instead of only recognizable vertical hierarchies, are part. So he writes, this question of universal community is therefore by definition posed in terms of how we inhabit the open, how we care for the open. And in this sense, he's inspired by Glissant's concept of tout monde, world's mentality, as it is also sometimes called. So before I move on to discussing Mbembe's latest book and how it elaborates on unkinning, I must turn to feminist science studies scholar Donna Haraway's seemingly opposite plea for making kin in her monograph, Staying with the Trouble. How to make sense of the best of contemporary black theory advancing towards unkinning, and the best of contemporary feminist theory advancing towards making kin instead. So in fact, making kin, so Haraway's argument, argues also for a qualitative shifting of Foucauldian power-knowledge structures, and its practice is equally post-humanist in spirit. Haraway writes, my purpose is to make kin mean something other or more than entities tied by ancestry or genealogy. Kin making is making persons, not necessarily as individuals or as humans. Interestingly, whereas Mbembe's African cosmologies deal differently with ancestry, and whereas genealogy has been reconfigured in continental philosophy, as well as in black and feminist theory, Haraway's plea for a denaturalization and a post-humanization of kinship relations is precisely what Mbembe's complex take on community to come stands for, as black people has more often than not been seen as non-persons, and continuing, and given that we must move beyond both individual personhood and the totalizing humanism of man. So Haraway is explicit about these requirements when she writes, "Kinships exclude as well as include, and they should do that. Alliances must be attentive to that matter. Making alliances requires recognizing specificities, priorities, and urgencies, intending to make kin while not seeing both past and ongoing colonial and other policies for extermination and or assimilation augurs for very dysfunctional families, to say the least," end of quote. So diffracting unkinning and making kin ultimately makes for an important practice of epistemology, methodology, politics, ethics. So before I move to my examples, in this new book of Mbembe, Politique de l'inimitié, he takes up the gauntlet of explaining the necessity of theorizing unkinning. Characterizing today's globalized world as enmitous and racism as informed by old and new nationalisms, Mbembe studies what could be the foundations of a common genealogy and hence of a politics of life beyond humanism. Mbembe argues for perpetual becoming, an ontological key, and for vulnerability as traversing enmity, demanding reciprocity and caring relationality amidst the actualization of a renewed project of racial classification and differentiation, which is what we find ourselves in right now. After having established, by taking the work of Frans Fanon as exemplary, first the being of both one earth and of a multiplicity of places as a permanent replacement for Europe as the center of gravity of the world, and second, the need to responsibly dwell on earth and cross borders, Mbembe writes in answer to his book Critique of Black Reason, then in relative clarity will emerge the demands, if not of a possible universalism, then at least of an idea of the earth as that which is common to us, our common condition. This emergence of the post-humanist demands of a transformed notion of universalism happens in a fragmented earthly language, rooted, he says, in the paradoxes of body, flesh, skin, and nerves. Historically and effectively embracing the body multiple is the only way in which a situated knowledge, as well as a new community, can emerge, he argues. And this is also how we may elaborate the necessary demands for the 21st century. So importantly, given the sociological, psychic, and algorithmic workings of the racialized and racializing unconscious, contributing to and being part of a common genealogy in a post-humanist key is not easy to do for either white or black scholars, whether in the African diaspora or on the decentered European or North American continent. In relation to this feminist and new materialist project on speculative epistemology, the following of Mbembe's questions from his latest book have the greatest relevance in relation to the actual doing of political and ethical genealogical work today. And I'm trying to answer to these questions in my current research. But to say that Europe is no longer the center of gravity of the world, how does that mean? Does that mean that the European archive is exhausted? Besides, has this archive truly been the product of a particular history only? Since the history of Europe has been confused for several centuries with the history of the world, and since the history of the world has been confused with Europe, does it not follow that this archive does not only belong to Europe? End of quote. So trying to see critically and creatively, that is intersectionally and interferentially, so diffractively, from the European experience, which I have to do because it is my situation, my location, we must start by way of situatedly affirming historical and affective multiplicity which is one of the tasks that I have set myself in my current research project. It is by starting from the archives of 3 female philosophers working from Europe as a colonial power. This is Eva Louise Young. She was born in 1861 and she died in 1939. And this is the only available picture of her. It's true. It's true. Another philosopher who's from the USA with a history of upper-class immigration from Europe. So this is Suzanne Langer, born in 1895, and she died in 1985. And the third one, who's working from the margins of French academia as the result of the looming threat of forced transportation from home and work in Western Europe to a site in Eastern Europe, a threat that became real and a transportation that resulted in death. So this is Helene Metzger. She was born in 1889 and she died in 1944. So all of these women have lived through at least one world war. And it is with them that I try to answer, partially and modestly, to Mbembe's call to imagine community differently from within the multiplicitously situated European archive as non-exhausted and as non-exhaustive, as a matter of fact. So the post-humanist element of attempting to make explicit not only a fragmented but also an earthly language implies an unanticipated working through and beyond entangled global, national and local socio-economic and political circumstances, planet Earth as affected by anthropogenic emissions, and the seen, felt, permeable and destructible body. Schisms, frictions and fictions around planet Earth have changed dramatically with the Anthropocene as well as with Web 3.0. And working through Young, Langer and Metzger, my 3 examples, I do that by taking them together and with a current figure, the Bulgarian-American Maria Popova, who was born in 1984, and her contemporary blogging practice, because I take this kind of connecting the 2 generations as exemplary for a genealogical project today that is archival and algorithmic. So to take you through this, so Maria Popova is, as I said, a blogger, and she writes a blog that is called Brain Pickings. I don't know if you have heard about it, but I would definitely suggest you kind of become a member, or how do you say, you register for her mailing list. And Popova is, for me, somebody who, through whose work, I can actually show how the archives of the 3 women I want to discuss, how those archives are non-exhausted and non-exhaustive. So this is just a random, well, of course nothing is random, but this is just one example of a brain pickings post, a blog post, which happens to be on Rebecca Solnit's book, the famous Man Explain Things to Me book. So this is basically how her blog post, it's just a random blog post. But the fact that she posts everything that she reads online every day, actually multiple times a day, allows you to do very close research on how her readings of particular texts come about. So I'm not going to read you through this particular blog post, but I'm just going to point at and then show how I'm working with her scholarship, not scholarship, with her writing. So you see that she constantly hyperlinks either to her own previous writings on related topics, but also to, in this case, Virginia Woolf's autobiographical writings. She constantly highlights the fact, or she's constantly abundant when it comes to making links. So here she links like one of Solnit's, here she links to one of Solnit's essays on Woolf, and that essay reads Woolf through Lawrence Gonzales, Borges, Dinesen, Orwell, Thoreau, Susan Sontag, A Botanist in Hawaii, Walt Whitman, Arthur Rimbaud, Joyce, Ovid, A Friend, etc., etc. And I think these links should be carefully studied as diffractions, because the list that I just read, according to a classic classificatory logic, all of these scholars have nothing to do with one another, and they're not even all scholars. So in one blog post, I think she references at least 50 people, but sometimes explicitly, sometimes not explicitly. So these are just, you could have written down all of these arrows. And she wants to do it this way. She wants to write blog posts this way because she says it translates very explicit. It translates seriously how she reads, and I would say how everybody reads. But like the academic tradition has kind of told us to kind of erase lots of connections we make when we do our research, because that's some connections we make are not scholarly, or some connections we make are not according to the canon, or something like that. And Popova, she's of course not hindered by academic conventions. She can just be very abundant in her archival work. And when she writes about doing the kind of writing she does, she, for example, is very explicit about like using the margins of a book as sites of knowledge production. So in this kind of small snippet, she talks about like finding her grandfather's books that and the margins of which has also been like completely covered by links, ideas, digressions, etc., etc. And that's what she wants to also put in her blog posts. And what I did with a couple of students is I asked students to visualize Maria Popova's website. So I asked them to do more or less traditional, like digital humanities research, not only because that would allow me to do research on the like wild connections that Popova makes, but also because I was thinking that it might help me write effectively about the three women that I want to do research on. And the important thing you have to know is that the archives of my three exemplary case studies are wild, or they are not existing. So it's the entire spectrum of archival work, a destroyed archive, or an archive that tries to include everything. And I'll be giving examples in a minute. So, and because of Popova's way of writing and her way of actually, literally archiving every single connection she makes, I thought that this could give me a lot of inspiration in terms of like how I could or should deal with my my three case studies. So the first visualization that my students made looked like this. It's like a completely non-accessible, like blob of links. And they have been going through multiple ways of visualizing the website. This is something I cannot do myself, by the way, and of zooming in and out of connections. So this is Maurice Sendak, who's apparently one of Popova's favorite references, and so is Susan Sontag. And they also have links to one another. And this is the students loved this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which they also found in Popova's archive. So they started to zoom in and out of that book. So, and of course, what I'm doing is, not only taking these visualizations at face value and researching them for the links Popova creates, but I also want to study the apparatus that my students used to visualize this website. So the world of links and weights and stuff behind visualizing Popova's website. So I could go on and on, like showing you all of these visualizations, but the point is, of course, to get at examples of the non-exhausted and non-exhaustive European archive, and why I need to go through Popova in the first place. So Suzanne Langer is important to me because people have always said about her work that it cannot be catalogued. It is impossible to catalog. She has like too many disciplines, meeting in her work, and it's vast. So Howard Gardner said this: Suzanne Langer's work cannot be catalogued. And this is actually something that Suzanne Langer herself would be very, very happy about. She wants to write about her own writing as something that cannot be catalogued. So this is what she says about her own writing. She says, despite all shortcomings, blind leads, or mistakes that they may see in each other's doctrines, I believe that Bell, Fry, Bergson, Grootje, Banch, Collingwood, Cassirer, and I, not to forget such literary critics as Barfield and Day-Lewis and others too, whom I have not named and perhaps not even read, have been and are really engaged on one philosophical project. So she really thinks and wants to write and writes about her writing in such a way that scholars that she has not named and perhaps not even read have influenced her thinking, in this case about art. So others whom I have not named and perhaps not even read. And in other places in her writing, she says the same thing. She says, for example, that there is a literature behind us known or unknown to any particular thinker. I mean, literature behind us known or unknown to any particular thinking. I find that pretty mind-blowing. And she wrote this in 1953. And when she writes about writing and writing her philosophy, she says that she could multiply quotations almost indefinitely, which shows you that being reductive about an archive, a philosophical archive, is it's a flaw in our thinking about thinking. So when it comes to Langer, I wanted to find a way of not necessarily filling this gap of scholars that she has not named, has not read, scholars that are not necessarily known to any particular thinker. And for that, I have developed a speculative methodology, or whatever as I call it right now. And it has something to do with the ways in which college students, not of my generation, because nobody reads Langer anymore, But students of a previous generation, when Langer was still part of the curriculum, what they had to do in order to prepare for the study of Suzanne Langer, and that is, these students actually had to read a book called The Modern Tradition. It's like 1,000 pages thick kind of anthology of both theory and fiction and poetry. And that's what they had to read in order to understand the philosophy in a new key of Suzanne Langer. So first I tried to find a digital copy of that book, The Modern Tradition, and I couldn't find it. So in order to do the research that my students did with Popova, I first had to scan that book, which also became a little bit of an aesthetic project, because scanning a book means you have to take it apart. At least that's what I had to do, because I'm not at, Harvard University, and I don't have all of those immersive kind of like scanning apparatuses. These are just some pictures. Here's my cat, who was very interested. He's never been interested in a book, but this book was very interested. Books became very material. So it had to travel to Utrecht. It had to be scanned. The scanning wasn't easy, etc. And now I'm working on trying to map the modern tradition in a similar way as my students have mapped Popova's website. So this is one example of working speculatively and working on an archive that will always be in motion, and that is not exhaustive, that is open, and that is generative. Then my second example, as I said, is Helene Metzger. And she is I should take this away. She is a historian of science who never got a job in French academia. I don't necessarily know why. Maybe because of her attitude. She was very, very critical of the history of the mentalities, which was a particular school of doing historical research, which was based on primitivism. And she was extremely against this. She was very much against this idea of a primitive people. So she was like, the history of the mentalities is flawed. We have to think differently about what it means for a people to have a certain mentality. It should not be predicated on a primitive people and lead towards us, of course. So her idea of mentality, so she started not only to do historical research, but she also started to write critically about epistemology, for example. And just one quote. So with a little bit of my own words. So Metzger's many studies into the history of the natural sciences have led her to conclude that, whilst constantly searching for a deepened understanding of the past, the historian also tries to, and here I quote her, I translated this, penetrate with greater certainty and more active sympathy the creative thinking of the past in which we're talking about the 30s, in which he infuses new life that he revives for a moment. Moreover, there is a personal subjective factor which is impossible to eliminate completely. It is better to admit it honestly than to deny it a priori. Historians, like all philosophers, like all scientists, and like all humans, have innate tendencies, individual but imperceptible ways of thinking that are themselves not yet opinions or even systems of thought, but that can and do engender such opinions and systems. So she wants to position herself beneath or alongside the outcomes of thinking, and she wants to try to reach a thought that is not yet an opinion, a statement, that cannot be classified, be systematized. So she is unwilling to separate thought from thinker, and she considers instead the thinker along embodied lines, with which she says that the historian, and here I quote her again, tries to find or recreate for a moment in itself the forces underlying the works that are the object of his meditation. And with all of those links that, for example, Popova makes, and that visualization apparatus can indeed make accessible to others. With an apparatus like that, I hope to also reach these forces. And with Metzger, the methodology then would be institutional, because her entire archive has been destroyed, although we can recreate where she has been and what she has heard, so conferences, symposia, whatever, right before she wrote very critical essays, because her critical essays, not her historical books, but her critical essays, were always written in response to a conference or in response to a seminar that she attended as the secretary, not as a participant. So she was just like observing, and then wrote sometimes furious essays about masculinity, about primitivism, about, she writes about, many things, and really passionately. So I think it is possible to recreate her archive, but then institutionally. So my third example, and then I'm going to stop, is Eva Louise Young. And I'm not going to talk about her philosophy that much. Where's that cool picture? Well, this is just words. I'm not going to talk about her philosophy very much, because it is very complicated. I have to dig much deeper into what she actually means. I mean, she writes about perception as a meeting in the market of matter. So, the materiality of the eye, of the body as a material, object being, everything around her. Perception is a meeting on the marketplace, on the market of matter. So she also writes about the kind of economic side of materialism, amaterialism. But that is not for now. The point is, at some point I was doing research behind my computer in the algorithmic condition, as we all do our research. And I literally stumbled upon Eva Louise Young's work. And this is what I saw. So this is a screenshot of Google Books, something we all use. So here I saw just a random scan of a book cover. And on the side, on the left, there is this word, A Philosophy of Reality by Eva Louise Young. So my first thought was, who is she? I mean, I'm a philosopher interested in female philosophers, and I had no idea who she was. At the same time, knowing stuff about algorithms and the algorithmic condition, I knew that she would be relevant for me, because I've trained my Google Books, to find relevant sources. So I looked, without even being intentional about it. So I started scrolling through that digital copy, and found out that in the book itself, you don't see Eva Louise. So there is literally in that physical object not a single reference to EL, meaning Eva Louise, nothing. So I became very interested in what that little, like Eva Louise in the margin was, and who actually produced that knowledge, who was communicating with me, and how we could actually understand that. So with Eva Louise, I became more interested in the whole research apparatus that I was part of. And yes, I read her book, but I'm still, thinking all the time about like finding her. And actually, when you read up on her, when you go into like Web of Science and all of these things, there's like references to her are all from the 30s. This book was published in the 30s, in 1930 actually. And most references talk about E.L. Young as a man, and the ones that write about her as a woman don't like the book because they say it's esoteric. So there's really gendered issues going on there. But most importantly, for now, and that's like the pre-final thing that I want to say, is that I found myself inspired by what bioinformatics people call nano publications and nano facts. So the bioinformatics people want to track and trace the smallest changes they themselves make and produce in terms of DNA, and so sequence changes and all of these things. And they record that and database that, and they call it nano publication. So the slightest change gets an author. So I've been using their kind of mappings of apparatuses in order to speculate about what it means that something that is so kind of behind closed doors as Google, what it means that Google actually produces knowledge for us. So I don't know if this has made sense, but what I've tried to do is sketch why I find it important today, in the 21st century, let's say, in the algorithmic condition, to work very closely on archives as non-exhaustive bodies, how research apparatuses that we are always already part of, how they may look, and how my three examples in different ways, how they may help me trying to grasp that non-exhaustivity that I'm interested in. And I think this non-exhaustivity is both very rich and powerful, and is something that the scholarly apparatus of classification doesn't allow us to take very seriously. But I also hope to have shown that because of like the accelerated times we're living in, that it should also be unpacked because it has to be critiqued. And that's what I've tried to say. And where am I at? Well, I think I'm trying to both read very closely, but also work with distant reading, because I think the textual bodies that we are dealing with, and they include visuals, are very big, very vast. I'm trying to include the non-text based, which is what, so the research apparatus, but also our own bodies. I hope to have shown that in order to engage in such a project, you're working both intellectually and very hands-on. I've never worked on the materiality of a book, for example, and it took us ages to visualize Popova's website, so there's also an aspect of material labor that I think also should be looked at very critically, because who is doing the scanning, for example, of all of those books in Google Books, etc. Well, there's positivist or empiricist and speculative methodologies involved in my project, and I'm trying to balance classification and cartography. Yeah, and that's all I had to say.
So I think if it's okay, we'll move into maybe a few questions, and we're all here first, and then we're going to move into the students who are enrolled in the directive readings for the seminar that this is part of. We'll interview you, and you're welcome to stay to listen if you want to. We're going to have a little break in between, so if you need to leave, by all means, and if you want to stay, you can stay, and that'll be probably another half hour after that for the interview. So, so please, I think we can just pop up questions. I don't think you need a moderator or anything. Questions?
It's not a. It's a funny question because it's about a word that you use that really tripped me up, and it's in your discussion of Mbembe.
Yeah.
And how you said so very interesting. Maybe I have two questions. One, you said that he's looking for a new foundation for how to think about rethink community, I guess. And I was surprised by the use of the word foundation. And
Same
it
as universalism.
It makes me nervous.
Yeah.
And I wonder how you respond to that as a new materialist, because it feels like a replacing of the previous with erecting a new starting point that erases potentially what was before that. So is he using foundation in a different way than that, or are you thinking of it that way, or is foundation just like not a very meaningful word, and we could have used another word there?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point, because he's even using universalism. He's using all of these words, but he gives them a different content. And when, for example, because what is universal is this, when it comes to the archive, it's the non-exhaustive archive. So something, he absolutely wants to do away with man, or as, the universal foundation. His foundationalism his foundation is completely different. It's becoming, it's movement, it's forces. And he still uses a certain language. Like when I started reading that book, I was like also worried about the universal and about the one and all of these things. But he tries to he flips the terminology completely. And in your question, you said something about a new starting point. I actually think it is very much what we are trying to do, trying to find a new starting point. But that starting point is simply not at the beginning of something. So, and this is not new. I'm not saying that this is part of the very newness of new materialism. This is why I'm always stressing that new materialism has to be approached genealogically, because the minute you say your starting point is in the middle, for example, there's already a whole archive that you're bringing along. So Karen Barat also talks about like meeting the universe halfway is a new starting point, but that starting point is not. She doesn't formulate that from a sort of linear logic either. I also like this I see this tension as pretty productive, because And what Mbembe also tries to do is to say that, okay, you know, our condition is algorithmic, to say it in my own terms, which actually doesn't mean that there are always multiple paths like available for everybody. He actually wants us to situate ourselves and be aware of both dialectics and differing. So I totally get your worry, and I see it as something that, that he really tries to give a new meaning or a new content to those terms. Is that an answer to your question?
Totally. Yeah, it reminds me of the what's the name of the producer who makes those movies for children like Totoro?
Oh, wow.
He's got one called who said it? Miyazaki? Yeah. He's got one called Howl's Moving Castle. And it's this like foundation that's always moving and more stuff piled up on top of it. And so if I think of it that way, then it makes sense.
Yeah, I also think he is one of those scholars that tries to say that, you know, it's very much in his work. Nobody owns these terminologies. You know, we can also not reclaim in the old-fashioned sense, but I mean, this is like one of my first articles that I wrote about Karen Barat had it as the title, "A New Starting Point, a New Metaphysics." That's how I read it. Did I see a hand? I thought I saw. That's right.
I don't know how to put this. So because you're working with generational feminism and genealogy, so I'm curious about how you think time, and we were talking how you like Whitehead too. So I'm just wondering, because I'm thinking about it a lot, maybe you can help me. Continuous becoming, Deleuze, right? And then Whitehead had a becoming of continuity. So if we look at your the diffractive readings of these feminists and stuff, if we take those two formulas and you're reworking of almost the concept of genealogy through the arithmetics and all that, so how would you use those two formulas? Which one would be more applicable to that? Is it that their overs almost are these continuations that are becoming anew in your context, or is it that there is a continuous trajectory of their becomings anew? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So you refer to Deleuze and Whitehead, whom I both read and like. But the scholar that I would answer, the philosopher that I would answer such a question with is Bergson, because he writes about virtuality and the virtual and the actual. So he argues that when you say that something is possible, you already assume you know a lot about the world, and you're in a way projecting possibilities based on the here and now, whereas the virtual and the actual makes the exact opposite movement of saying that, yeah, there is an actualization, but it tells you nothing about what else may actualize in, you know, the next minute or in the future. So that's what I would say. So there's continuous actualizations, but they don't say anything about what may also actualize, whereas at the same time actualizations may gain weight, may gain like world historical weight. You know, this is what Sarah Ahmed says a lot in her work. So and also those very oppressive forms of world history as unequal power relations. Also, that doesn't say anything about the future. Yeah, it says a lot about the near future, but that's about it. Hopefully, we need to work with that hope. Yeah. So I don't know if that makes any sense, and if you can map like the two versions of becoming and continuity onto my answer. But I work with those two concepts. Yes.
Iris, could you just comment on how this your speculative methodology would relate ontologically to what we made this becoming, this idea of shifting into new ways of thinking? What would it yield? I know you've given some nice cautionary, sort of things around really suppressing that urge to simplify, etc. So how would this speculative approach help us to see differently and to be differently in the context?
Yeah. Well, it has a lot to do with what I just said, I think. Because I think as scholars and also as persons, we tend to end up in grooves, methodologically. I think this, like the current time, the current algorithmic condition, makes it very urgent to kind of not end up in some sort of methodological groove. So that's why I'm trying to do this speculative research. And I actually find it interesting that my case studies are all from a long time ago. Because I seriously see these three women as Popova's ancestors in a way. I think they are very insightful because they force me to do a lot of work and to not leap into this very positivist kind of side to like the digital humanities or something like that. Although I think it's way more complicated. Maybe I should say a few words about this algorithmic condition because it is a concept that was developed by a colleague of mine, Felicity Colman from Kingston, and it tries to reflect the idea that the most, and it's a Canadian product, this book, The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge by Lyotard, ends with ICTs impacting knowledge and knowledge production and crisis of legitimization and legitimacy, etc. And what we are trying to say with the algorithmic condition is that yes, Lyotard is a gigantic source of inspiration because he was projecting, in a way, speculating about like what ICTs would do to our knowledge production. But these ICTs have now changed. So that's what we are trying to map at this point. So that's kind of the paradigm shift behind a lot of this research. And knowing that, it's really an and. It's like to use Petra's words. It's continuous becoming, or the continuity of, or the becoming of continuity. That constant movement, but it's also cooperation, corporations, and trademarks, and awful scanning practices in places we don't know, and the environmental effects of all of these data centers, and so it's both. And I'm trying to find ways of dealing with both sides of today's algorithmic condition. Is that an answer to your question? A little bit? Yeah. 1979, right? That was the postmodern condition. Yeah. Sorry?
Almost 40 years.
Almost 40 years ago. Yeah. But it's interesting, you can almost like start from the page one and rewrite it for today. All of his questions are still relevant. I find it fascinating.
So I think what we'd like to do is just, first of all, thank you very much for a really amazing, thought-provoking. I can just literally see wheels turning in everybody's minds. And we have a gift for you from the place, a place location. And so I'll pass.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to gift you with what is a talking stick, and the talking stick has a life force around being a symbol of some of the local First Nations traditions. In particular, this one was carved from yellow cedar, so it has special qualities in terms of coming from our local place as well. The yellow cedar grows here. It was also carved by an artist, a local artist, Jim Yelton, who is from the Squamish Nation, and his wife and family. He lives with his wife and family in Sechelt, which is has a dialogue with Squamish Nation in terms of many family connections. The other aspect of it is carved in the image of a bear, which has a life force around leadership, around discernment, looking at family. And we learn a lot from the bear because when we watch the bear, we see how it gathers berries and fishes. So I'd like to present you with this on behalf of our community. And thank you so much for your lovely help.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and probably you might want a little break for a minute as we settle. If you'd like to stay to listen in on the interview, you're very welcome to. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming for this really interesting, provocative discussion. And if you are new to the new Materiality seminar, you're welcome to just, there's an email. I think if you're here, it's because you got some email, and on there is my email address, and you can just RSVP if you'd like to come to our conversations. It's open to everybody. The next one is next Monday at 1 o'clock in the West Mall, something. Pardon? Yeah. And that'll be next week, and then I think we have a break, but the schedule is all there. And then just before thinking about labor and who does work that's not always recognized or categorized, it's often everything that we do is made possible by the staff at our Faculty of Education in terms of helping all this to come through. I'd like to thank Brian Lee for helping us coordinate all these technologies and IT services, and I don't know your specific names, I'm sorry, but thank you very much for doing this today. And I'd like to thank Susan Warren and Debbie Pruder, who have looked after the registration for the directed studies. This is what they call an extraordinary course because this is very out of the ordinary for our faculty, and they have made it all possible by being very extraordinary. So I'd like to thank them. They're not here, but they also thought, it was Susan who thought of the refreshments and so on. So on behalf of our group, I'd just like to thank all of you. So thanks very much for coming, and we hope to see you at future sessions.